Aloha, talofa, lava, and hafade. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security Pacific Executive Leaders Program, or PELP, as most of you know it, a speaker series. I'm David Fukutomi. I'd like to give a special welcome back to the alumni of our previous PELP session. Some of you have been to the Hilo Traditional Leadership sessions. Some of you participated in our topic-specific offerings on port restoration, power restoration, or disaster housing. And I know some of you have been to previous speaker series offerings, so welcome. And for those of you that are participating for the first time, welcome to you as well. And we hope that this is the first of many opportunities you have to participate with us. Today's webinar is the second part in our series. Most of you were on yesterday with Glenn Woodbury, our director. Today is a follow-up to that about embracing emergency management. And it's my pleasure to introduce a friend and longtime colleague. He's also a supporter of the center as well as an alumni. Jim Featherstone has held a number of positions in the public safety arena. He was a career firefighter with Los Angeles City Fire Department. He was the general manager of the emergency management department. He was the interim fire chief for the city of LA. And until recently, until his retirement, he was the executive director of the Los Angeles Homeland Security Advisory Council. Jim has been a speaker and part of our team at delivering PELP sessions before, and we're honored to have him here today. So Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Thanks to you and thanks to the CHDS team, an amazing group of folks, especially Sarah and Nichelle. They're really good at helping a Luddite like myself manage, some of the technical stuff that we have to do in today's virtual world. What I would like to do today, the technology permitting, is to actually go over some things, some topics that are near and dear to me, and hopefully not necessarily will become near and dear to you, but actually may cause you to ask some questions, some wheres and whys and why nots about how we function these days. Welcome to all the private sector, public sector people participating in the webinar today, everyone from urban and rural environments, the maritime environment, and all the various disciplines. So we talked about emergency management. So New York City OEM, a guy named Kelly McKinney actually put together this little video back in '07 when people asked, what is emergency management? And you'll see some of the stuff here is dated, but it kind of speaks to the essential emergency manager.
Not all disasters are alike. They can be viewed on a spectrum, from the simplest accident to a major disaster. Most of these emergencies don't need to be managed. They're handled by police officers, firefighters, EMTs, and other responders as routine matters. So what happens when really bad emergencies need more capability than the individual agencies can provide? That's where emergency managers come in, to coordinate all the agencies. And the bigger the scope of the incident, the more an emergency manager's value increases. Let's show this with a worst-case example. The largest of all disasters in terms of scale, complexity, and consequences is a nuclear strike. This is the mother of all disasters. Imagine some bad guys get a hold of 140 pounds of highly enriched uranium and figure out how to cobble together a working bomb, an improvised nuclear device. They get it into place and set it off. The result is confusion, fear, and chaos. Think of our society as a complex Rubik's Cube, interdependent systems that have developed over time to sustain our way of life. A nuclear attack severs our connections to the rest of society. Fear and anxiety would take over as the rhythm of our daily life is destroyed. So if that's the emergency, when does the management come in? Management is what emergency managers do, to create order from that chaos. Our job is to squeeze the timeline so we bring back order faster. The hard part is how. So let's take a look at the way emergency managers work. First, we get a few emergency managers together, in the field or in a room, and start working. We find the facts and tell the story. We tell who's in charge, what's happening, is it getting worse or getting better, and what are we doing and what needs to be done. We start to re-establish the connection severed by the blast. In the Emergency Operations Center, we begin to connect people and organizations to the city and to each other. We tell them to connect inside and outside their own organizations with the same message. This is what is happening, and what do you see to inform this picture? By doing this, we're creating a new organization, one that didn't exist before and will never exist again. Imagine this incident organization as a pyramid with 3 distinct levels. At the top is the strategic level, with agency executives, local, state, federal, and elected officials, where political objectives are translated into strategy. At the bottom of the pyramid is the biggest and most important level, the tactical level, or the people who we call the boots on the ground. And in the middle is where strategy is translated into effective action, where what we need to get done becomes the how we'll do it. We call this the operational level, and this is where the emergency managers sit. Their job is to support everybody, and they do it by managing information, telling everybody everything, managing resources, getting the right stuff to the right place at the right time, and managing consequences, finding and solving problems. But even if you were doing all that, you're still not done. You must tell everyone everything that you're doing all the time. It's critical for the leadership to know the facts so they can convey it to the public. This connection creates trust with the impacted population, and without it, credibility is lost and our work won't matter. Some experts in government and academia believe that disaster response consists of leadership and the field, and that there's no need for the emergency managers. But the fact is, emergency managers create the incident organization that can manage the catastrophe. Only then can we turn our corner fast enough, where order is not yet restored, but the sense of order is palpable. The problem is that during a catastrophe, the only thing that doesn't grow quickly enough is the number of emergency managers at the operations level. We simply can't get big enough, fast enough. Keep in your mind this image of a catastrophic incident versus a tiny brake pad. Is this going to be able to manage this job? We have to be able to build this brake pad really big enough, fast enough, so we can create this incident organization and use it as the initiating mechanism for order, the starting point, back to that Rubik's Cube of complexity.
So what you see on the screen right now is actually the official definition of emergency management. We're only going to be concerned with the first sentence there, the managerial function charged with creating a framework which help communities reduce vulnerability to hazards and cope with disasters. What I thought was a more contemporary and more practical definition was actually in this slide and the next one, which was in a Toronto Sun article, which was part of the read-ahead. It talks about it's the only government function which is designed to take in information from all sectors, every ministry in the Canadian parlance, and every critical infrastructure to operate in and advise on disasters and emergencies. And so it's I really like this, the only function which specializes in handshake artistry, getting highly specialized groups, and it lists them there, to come to a consensus on an emergency timetable. That to me is the essence of what emergency management does. I work with Joe Bruno, the former commissioner for New York City OEM. He told me a long time ago, he says, I don't have operational or tactical authority or responsibility for anything, but I have the power to convene. And this is very important, to be the ability and the desire and to have the skill and the artistry to get these different components together and bring them to the table. Why do we need emergency management? What keeps us awake at night? What threats, hazards, major disasters? The Robert T. Stafford Act lists, 16. There's hurricane, tornado, all of these. If you happen to live in Los Angeles, 13 of the 16 could happen on any given day. We distilled these 13 major disasters defined in the Stafford Act down to what we call the Magnificent Seven: pandemic, violent actors, catastrophic earthquake, catastrophic wildfire, cyber event, adverse weather, and large public assemblages. Next slide. So the Magnificent Seven, those of you, people say, well, why the Magnificent Seven? Some of us on this call are old enough to remember a classic Western with Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen, Charles Bronson, but it's actually based on the Seven Samurai, which is a classic fable in Japanese literature. And then you see the three iterations there. So even down to the contemporary Magnificent Seven with Denzel Washington. So we thought it was a little ironic twist to actually call these threats and hazards the Magnificent Seven. So, like I said, pandemic, violent actors, catastrophic earthquake, catastrophic wildfire, cyber, and adverse weather, and large public assemblages. Pandemic, we were talking about this. Look, somebody showed me a YouTube that we did back in, probably around 2009 or 2010. We were talking about pandemic as being the biggest threat because we kind of looked at it then as sort of like hazmat. You couldn't necessarily see it, taste it, or smell it, but it was really bad and would do a lot of harm. The other thing is we knew back then that pandemics or these bad bugs moved at the speed of the fastest public travel conveyance. In 1918, the flu moved at the speed of steamships and passenger trains. And of course, a year ago, well, actually a little more than a year ago, we saw COVID-19 move at the speed of a 500-mile-an-hour jetliner. Violent actors. This is really significant, and there are a number of them. The tough part of building this slide was to decide which violent action that had happened on our shores since 9/11 that I want to use to represent the violent actors in the Magnificent Seven. And of course, catastrophic earthquake here in Los Angeles, but not necessarily, the dry side of it. Tsunamis are tied with earthquakes. It's a bunch of things. Those of us that live in earthquake land know that this is one of the things that we have to think about all the time. Catastrophic wildfire. Devastating. I remember talking to Brock Long when he was the FEMA administrator, and he'd been through a number of hurricanes, floods, tornadoes in his career. He had never seen the devastation wrought by a wildland interface fire until he went up in Northern California several years ago and saw the devastation there. So that's something we live with. Cyber. It's been here for a while. It's just more devastating because we're more and more dependent on the ones and zeros. I was talking with Ron Lane. He was the former emergency manager for San Diego County several years ago. He says some of these large power blackouts that we have, he says that's what a really significant cyber attack might look like for the general population. When the grid doesn't function anymore, when the traffic signals don't function, when the electric valving on gas, on pipelines, on water, all that doesn't function anymore. We're heavily dependent on electrons, and everything's controlled by computers. Adverse weather. So we used to talk about climate change issues, but up until a few months ago, that wasn't very politically correct. So we decided we'd come up with a name that was pretty much evergreen, and we talk about adverse weather. Whether it's related to climate change or whatever you want to say, the adverse weather events that we've had probably over the last decade have been significant. So adverse weather definitely had to be one of the Magnificent Seven. And of course, overlay on any of the previous six, large public assemblages or just the human capital in our society by itself. We everything that we do is about people. So you overlay that on any of the previous six of the Magnificent Seven, and it adds another complexity to it. So why this topic? A paper that was written, I think it's going to be uploaded to the CHDS site. Mario Rueda, who was the first chief deputy of LAFD years ago. I've known him for years, worked for him for a long time. He wrote a pretty interesting paper. I mean, it's not some journal article tome that you have to wade through and drink 2 cups of coffee just to understand it. It's pretty basic. And he talks about some pretty good stuff. Mario spent over 4 decades as a career firefighter. He's been in every rank from a firefighter up to now he's the fire chief of San Marino, small community east of LA. But he was the guy on the Los Angeles Fire Department for a long time. We used to say it was WWMD. What would Mario do? That was your check on any of the efforts that you made. You wanted to make sure you were always in compliance with Chief Rueda because he knew a lot of things. He was very good. definitely had a sound tactical background, but he was strategic and one of the best thinkers I've ever had the opportunity to work with in my career. He's also an alumni of the ELP program. In his paper, he talks about three key points: developing the skill of sense making, improved understanding of community, economic, and social and political factors, and developing the strategic view. What Mario opines or submits in his paper is that the embracing or educating senior leaders, embracing and or educating themselves in terms of the basic components of emergency management, the responsibilities, the tenets, the perspectives, actually would enhance these three capabilities for senior leaders. Again, developing the skill of sense making, improved understanding of community, economic, social, and political factors, and developing the strategic view. So development of the skill of sense making. I like that term sense making because it's pretty obvious. It means making sense of things. During the initial chaos in novel, escalating, or large scale and or complex incidents, very important there, sense making actually in Rueda's paper, he talks about the placement of issues into frameworks, comprehending what's going on, redressing surprise, constructing meaning, interacting in pursuit of understanding, and development of patterns. So these are all very, very important, and they make sense. The neat thing I found in Rueda's paper was that, like I said, you didn't have to have a dictionary out. I mean, it was very plain spoken, and it spoke to having a much more comprehensive perspective of crisis management. People always say, well, emergency management, that's about NIMS. Yeah, NIMS is a starting point, it's a framework. It definitely speaks to common terminology and establishes some basic responsibilities. We all know post 9/11, it was intended for a multitude of disciplines. It was a framework of command components and checklists for when you had very low situational awareness during the hyperdynamic or escalating phase or when there was chaos. It brought some structure. I was with a team that went over to Japan right after their big tsunami and earthquake. And I was surprised they don't have a national incident management system. At that time, they didn't. They didn't have a FEMA-like organization. And those were two of the things that they were asking a lot of questions about. How did we get the nation to be able to, everybody wasn't in lockstep, but at least move in a similar direction. NIMS isn't without its detractors. In fact, I think that we didn't do a good job of educating the nation about NIMS early on because we took the organizational application of NIMS from Big Campaign Wildfire and we said Palookaville, Missouri is going to be able to do the same thing. No, the ideas and the concepts are the same, but the application is different. So a lot of detractors talked about NIMS or ICS being fire-centric, too many forms, too rigid, and it doesn't work in my discipline. So that's the classic thing with all the disciplines, all of us on the call, the NIH syndrome, not invented here. So fire service adapted it very readily. Health to some degree because we had Hicks, but a lot of the response and support disciplines were a little hesitant. Government solved that problem. They attached money to NIMS compliance. And so a lot of folks just kind of check the box and move along. The other thing that in Rueda's paper, he talks about recognition prime decision making. A lot of us have read Gary Klein's work, The Sources of Power. So with recognition prime decision making, he actually studied, he was trying to figure out, he was doing a study for the military on why combat commanders make certain decisions. But at that time, there weren't as many wars as we've had in the last 2 decades. So he studied firefighters and he came up with this term of recognition prime decision making because fire officers, they would ask why they made certain decisions. They would say just, well, we knew to make those decisions. So recognition prime decision making became very popular in the last decade in terms of why people make those decisions. However, I would ask the question, do we actually use RPDM at the senior level or at the strategic or the grand strategic level? In fact, we have a little quick poll. Can we bring in the poll right now? So based on your understanding of RPDM, is it applicable to the novel, escalating, large scale, or complex emergency? 69% said yes, and 31% said no. That was pretty simple. The challenge is that's not the, so let's figure, David, the team, I don't know if we can pick a couple of people to say, why they said yes, and a couple of people as to why they said no.
I'll pop in here and just give a guess. I think recognition prime decision making is specifically in reference to when you're faced with a complex decision, and it's what you fall back on. So I think in that case, it would be useful. But obviously there would be limitations of your biases and your previous experiences.
I would say yes and yes. I think from my perspective, my experience, RPDM can be used, throughout the spectrum of crisis decision making. I don't know that it is informed enough for the strategic or grand strategic levels. The novel escalating large complex incidents, no experience, no recognizable pattern. How do you make sense of the situation? RPDM is one of the things that you would use, but I remember being, on the fire ground, and what now I go back and I realized was actually me using RPDM to make decisions. I don't know if I would use the same or apply the same sense to decisions I made as an executive or as a senior fire officer. At the strategic level, it may beg for a little more complex thought. Not that we're going to sit there and ponder, because even at the strategic level, in a evolving, escalating emergency, decisions have to be made in a fairly small time frame. So that brings us to David Snowden. David Snowden, I want to thank David Snowden because he helped me learn Welsh. Was it Cynefin? Many of us have seen the Cynefin framework. It's applicable across all disciplines and sectors. Looking at the Cynefin framework, we see new viewpoints. Assimilation of complex concepts addresses problems when faced with novelty, what questions to ask versus pursuing the right answer. This is what I was saying, maybe the decision-making or the thought generating process may need to be a little more complex at the strategic level, at the senior leader level, than at the, let's say, the fire officer or the police sergeant's level, or the public works supervisor's level right there on the ground. One of the challenges I have with RPDM is that it also leaves you a little more vulnerable to confirmation bias, or I don't know if this is even a term, experiential bias, where, that if I haven't seen it and I can't associate it to anything that I've seen, then where does that leave me? And I think the Cynefin framework may not work on ultra rapid decision making, but it may have a place, as we get a little more arm's distance from the actual tip of the spear. What Snowden also talks about is the 2x2 matrix, the categorizational model and the sense-making model, and Cynefin being the sense-making model, but the other one is a 2x2 matrix. So Gordon Graham, who is a public safety risk manager, speaks a lot. I've known Gordon for years. Gordon's risk management model is on the left. He talks about high risk, low frequency, and then his the upper left-hand quadrant, he even overstrikes that, because the decision you if it's high risk, low frequency, Gordon says high risk means that people, infrastructure, or economy are at significant risk, and low frequency means it doesn't happen often, means that you don't have a lot of experience there. So he divides it again, subdivides that quadrant to decision-making time, the DT, and no decision-making time, the NDT. With Snowden says this 2x2 matrix is, the matrix is there and then you overlay the data. With the Cynefin model, you have the data and then you apply the framework, the structure. The categorization model, the framework precedes the data, and the sense-making model, data precedes the framework. It's kind of like, do you use the tools first, or do you, and then you develop the plan, or do you develop the plan and then decide what tools you want to use? So I don't know. What do you think? We got another poll coming up. Hopefully we can get some people to weigh in on the poll. So which model is more applicable to leaders with crisis management strategy responsibilities? The categorization, high risk, low frequency model, or the sense making Cynefin model?
Ethan Allen made a comment that he'd argue that both.
I would agree. Not that you need me to agree with you, but I think both. I think that the further you get away from the tip of the spear, though, I would say the sense making model gives you a more comprehensive decision making tool. But I think both of them have a place. For me, I would use the especially Graham's risk matrix to actually give me a starting point. The challenge with the 2x2 risk matrix is that the complexity of the large scale event or complex event, the complexity of a complex event might not fit that model. And so the complex and the plethora of data from a large scale event or complex event, you may need to take that in and then find, build a decision making or decision discerning structure behind that. The second point in the Rueda paper is he talks about improved understanding of community, economic, social, and political factors. An example of this is, so in 2003, we had the Cedar Fire. It was a wake-up call, basically caused the fire service to begin to understand emergency management a little more. So the history of the Cedar Fire is that we had significant winds, which, I mean, everybody thinks that wildland fires are based on heat, but it's actually a lack of low humidity and high winds that put us in this situation. So we had significant Santa Ana winds predicted. The fire started October 25th at around 5:30 in the evening. And in San Diego, the Emergency Operations Center wasn't activated until the wee hours of the morning the next day. Because at that time, the fire service really in California, they knew of emergency management, but the ability to bring emergency management into a crisis wasn't as widespread as it is today. With the Cedar Fire, FEMA concluded that critical lack of timely information, fire location, fire behavior, is the first day, the critical stages of a fire when it's first starting to take off. No fire operations branch leader in the EOC, that increased the EOC struggle to gain real-time information and situational awareness on the fire progress and the direction of this fire. Fire is moving really quickly. The lack of up-to-date information created problems in the assignment of law enforcement who has the evacuation lift. Moving the people out of the way of the fire is law enforcement's role. So there wasn't this coordinated effort that we see these days. We had the Thomas Fire several years ago in Ventura County, where we had the three legs of the stool all work very, very well together. Emergency management, fire, and law enforcement work very well. Historically, the thing in wildland firefighting is to anchor the fire and then flank it. What Ventura County did, and they did this by working with emergency management, the sheriff's department, and the fire department, was to be able to say, we have a significant wind-driven fire. We're not going to put it out right away. So we're going to put most of our effort in terms of getting the human capital out of the way of this fire. And so for the significant loss, the infrastructure, material loss of this fire, they had two fatalities, and they weren't necessarily based on direct fire impact, but they had two fatalities. But the breadth and scope of this fire, for them not to lose anyone else, was a miracle. But this was because all three agencies were working together, and all three agencies, the Emergency Management Agency itself, of course, embraced the tenets and the perspectives of emergency management. So fast forward 4 years later to the San Diego firestorms of 2007. Several fires. The initial wildfire was the Harris Fire, again fueled by Santa Ana winds. The fire starts at 9:23 in the morning of October 21st. The EOC is notified within minutes at 9:55. The EOC is activated a few hours later at 11:16 on the 21st. Within minutes, Alert San Diego had people responding to the EOC to help, not with the command and control of the incident, but the coordination of it, understanding the impacts of across the spectrum the public and private sectors that a crisis actually has on the whole community. Comparing the two, so the fires start, OES not notified initially in the Cedar fire in 03. They were notified within minutes in 07. The EOC is activated almost 12 hours later from after the start in 03. In 07, the EOC is activated an hour and 21 minutes later, significantly helped in terms of evacuation, getting the word out, and having the whole of community begin to work to mitigate the impact of this crisis. Rueda submits that understanding the challenges and complexity of the problems with evacuating the population at the Cedar fire, in the after action report of the retrospective understanding of the Cedar fire had a significant impact on how things were handled moving forward. A greater embrace of the understanding of emergency management concepts and perspectives. Strategy, policy, or tactical operations. So Arne Howard and Dutch Leonard at Harvard, in their book, Managing Crises, they talk about some of the issues, and this is what emergency management deals with a lot of times, is be able to integrate the political will, or so some of us would say the political why not, being a little facetious here, but integrating the political will. Elected political leaders need to be brought into the process a lot sooner. Talking to law enforcement colleagues and being on the fire side, a lot of times you don't want to see the suits come up to you while you're in the middle of, handling something. But a good place to integrate them in terms of raising their situational awareness and having them be a part of the policy making and policy disseminating process is in the Emergency Operations Center or your component that, your entity that handles that. In the private sector, how much of the political sector actually not necessarily has some say in what you do in terms of managing operational issues in a crisis, but having that perspective or being able to understand it might be important to your C-suite decisions. Many tactical or operational decisions overlap political issues, economic issues, and social issues. Jeff Reed, who was a longtime fire officer here in Southern California, actually ran the LA County's Office of Emergency Management for a while. He said it wasn't until he became a senior chief officer that he understood the impacts of the incidents, as he calls it, outside the yellow tape. Those impacts affected things like housing availability, economic recovery, restoration of public and private infrastructure, all those things that folks in the operational and operational support disciplines don't necessarily look at, but the emergency manager looks at all those. The emergency manager has to handle issues pre, trans, and post-crisis. So developing the strategic view. So Rueda says, senior executives are expected to make decisions in a complex, politically or jurisdictionally fragmented environment. The strategy ultimately is driven by political, legal jurisdiction, as well as tactical considerations. He also says the senior executives are better positioned to consider strategic interests when they embrace more complete view provided by emergency management education. And he's not saying that senior leaders or senior executives should become emergency managers, but understanding the breadth and scope of contemporary emergency management is actually a value add in terms of understanding and executing in complex, large-scale, rapidly moving, and novel incidents. So distilling it down to simple things, the 4 C's, I would say convene, coordinate, collaborate, and catalyze are key components of contemporary emergency management. Why is that important? So the graphic there on the right is, and those of you that have heard me talk before, I talk about the cone and the cube. By convening, coordinating, and causing collaboration, the emergency, those capabilities or characteristics of emergency management get the right people at the table. So those entities listed on the left, the government perspective, whether it's operational support or coordinating perspective, the private sector perspective, which perspective is missing, which perspective is the right perspective, So if you look at peephole A on the right, the person looking or the groups looking through that side, they see a triangle. So the people or entities looking through the peephole B in the top, they see a circle. So by getting these folks together, causing discussions, causing work-throughs and frameworks, we actually find out what's actually in the cube. What's really in the cube? It's a cone. So because of our professional perspective, our professional biases, our experiential biases, how long we've been in the job, whether we're new to the job, et cetera, we all look at the challenges slightly different. So this cone is pretty simple, but depending on our biases and our perspectives, we all look at it differently. So by getting everybody in the room together, so to speak, going back to Joe Bruno's The Power to Convene, the emergency manager has the ability to help people flesh out what these actually should be. So what happens if you get 21 perspectives working together? So we see if each one of those folks on this pit crew represented a discipline or a sector or different perspective, in your crisis management team, they each do a job, they each do it very well. People talk about silos or stovepiping or cylinders of excellence. It's real important to have those because they bring a certain value to the game. But the important thing is, can they work together, and how do we encourage that collaborative, that segmented but collaborative, that's kind of an oxymoronic statement, that segmented but collaborative effort, but moving in the same direction. So if you think about each one of these 21 pit crew members as a cylinder of excellence as to what they actually do, they're all coming together to get this car in and out of the pit as quickly and safely as possible. We have one question during the break. It talked about, can you discuss the value of proactivity, planning, practices, drills, et cetera, scenarios? It's a very, very good question. So since a lot of what we this paper and a lot of what we're talking about today is directed up or to the senior level, the executive level, or in the private sector, the C-suite, that's very important because it's interesting. We used to do this this diagram that had a triangle, then the same triangle inverted. So you overlay those, and so this triangle shows the amount of responsibility. So you start with the pointy end of the triangle, and as you move up in the hierarchy of organizations, your responsibility increases. So the inverse of that is that your planning, preparing, your training, your drills is inversely proportional to that, so it decreases. So the folks that make the really, really heavy strategic decisions, the far-reaching strategic decisions, the typical acceptance is, well, they've got to this point because they've been through it all. But the thing is that they don't practice it that often, and so it's about sets and reps. So they don't need to, so the people at that level don't necessarily need to go out and do weekend drills or weekly drills or monthly drills. But a good thing to do is in your planning is to exercise it. Red teaming. Red teaming is a really, really good way to get senior leadership involved in planning or wargaming or working through crisis issues. So at the level, at the breadth and scope that they tend to work at, you can't cover everything, but you can begin to develop the thought process, in terms of, what are we thinking about? So I found in my experience, the red teaming is a really good way to get engagement, awareness development, and knowledge building at the C-suite or the senior level. Hopefully that speaks to the question that was asked. I didn't see the name who asked it, but any comments on that, on planning, preparing, training, and drilling at the senior level? Historically, crisis response was the purview or in the cylinders of excellence of Big Blue and Big Red, police and fire. But those jurisdictions or those companies where crisis management, where everybody has a role or has a perspective or has a seat at the table, not necessarily in the decision-making roles, but bringing their perspective to the table. Those tend to be the more successful crisis managing companies or governments or jurisdictions. Here's an example. November 1, 2013, the shooter enters Terminal 3 at Los Angeles International Airport at 9:20. The shooter is suppressed literally 5 minutes later. Sadly, one TSA facility and 2 TSA injured, and several civilians were injured also. The airport was back up and operational within 30 hours. From 9:20 that morning, 30 hours later, the full airport was up and running. In less than 12 hours, all the terminals, there's 6 terminals at LAX, all the terminals except Terminal 3 were up and running, were operational. So this had a lot to do with, in being in the incident command post, this had a lot to do with the law enforcement partners saying, okay, we need to continue with, a lot of our investigative, and our law enforcement tactical efforts, but what can we do? What do we need to do to get the resumption of business commerce and protect the public to get this place back up and running? One, because LAX is a significant, the other thing, LAX is a huge link in global air travel. So to take that link offline or out of the chain of global air travel for just a couple of hours, not to mention, overnight, is huge. The repercussions, the ripples on that pond were far and wide. But to be able to get that airport back up and be fully operational, all terminals operational, 30 hours after this tragic event happened, had a lot to do with, one, the team at LAX embracing emergency management across the different capabilities there. The other thing is that the greater Los Angeles community being able to embrace emergency management and understanding, about this, life safety, incident stabilization, resumption of business commerce, government, and get those things back up and running. Because the crisis doesn't happen in a silo. Dutch Leonard, who is one of the authors of the Managing Crises book, he talks about the attention of senior officials. They're a key resource for tactical and strategic issues, and we need to work harder and develop better doctrine and associated training. This goes back to the question earlier about training. Talks about how to focus and parse their concentration. Like I said, so in my experience, the 2 biggest bangs for the buck are the senior level tabletop exercise and red teaming. Red teaming is a really good way to what if different scenarios. And the tabletop exercise is, from a practical perspective, is easy to do. It's cost effective. You're not going to get a lot of the senior officials to go through the kabuki show full scale exercises. But you can get them for a limited amount of time in a really, really well done tabletop exercise. I actually talk through some scenarios, because in today's world, we know that a failure of imagination means a failure, period. You will fail unless you have some imagination in terms of what could happen, not what will happen, but what could happen. So it goes back to, like you said, training. So it's not training in the sense that we learn at the tactical level, rules, tools, processes, and procedures, but the training might be just a series of questions. Because when you get to the strategic level, as Snowden says, it's really important what questions you ask as opposed to knowing what the right thing is to do. You need to know what the right thing is to do, but the higher you get in the food chain, it's very important that you ask the right questions. We were talking about different things that we do and the whole of community embracing emergency management. We moved the space shuttle several years ago. Space shuttle came to town. and it moved 17 miles. It took 64 hours to move the space shuttle 17 miles. The lead agency was the Bureau of Engineering because of, streets. They were worried about the space shuttle breaking through some of the streets. We had to move utility poles. We had to cross bridges. They had to move light standards. The space shuttle went through 3 different jurisdictions: LA City, LA County unincorporated areas, and the city of Inglewood. So there was a lot of moving pieces here. And one of the first things that the Bureau of Engineering did is they came over to the Emergency Management Department and said, how do you guys address large scale events and emergencies? Help us understand in the next 60 days or so, I forget how long it was, how to organize this and how to look at this through the lens of emergency management. They said, because one, you guys do it, it's to a large extent, it's project management and it's coalition building, which go hand in glove. The other thing is that Big Blue and Big Red are very familiar with it. Big Blue and Big Red show up, and Big Yellow, Public Works, they all show up when you guys call a meeting. You have the reputation of convening. So we want to piggyback on that reputation, that inertia that you've developed of a community that is into working collaboratively. The 4 C's, actually can come to bear in this. The whole world is going to be watching us move this space shuttle 17 miles. So that's what happened. And so it's a perfect example of a community looking at an issue. Fortunately, this was not a hostile issue, but it was large. It was large scale. It was complex, and it had the potential for chaos. So this was from the crisis management world, it was a benign incident, but it definitely had the complexity and the significance of a lot of the emergencies. It definitely takes a village. This was an amazing event, but it is a perfect example of all the emergency response and emergency support agencies coming together. And we were able to do it for this event because we had done it for so many other events. And it was just, this was not to minimize the significance of it, but it was just another event because the greater community here had done the sets and reps, not just in events, but through the trainings, the exercises, from the C-suite all the way down to the boots on the ground. This was novel. I mean, how many people move a space shuttle through their city on any given day? I really like the video. I think when the space shuttle wing goes by the balcony with all the guys hanging out there, I thought that was pretty cool. But anyway, like I said, it takes a village. Communities that are able to apply emergency management concepts, tenets, perspectives on hostile events and on benign events or blue sky events like this tend to fare better, when things really get bad, because it becomes, crisis management muscle memory at the tactical level and certainly at the grand strategic level. And the folks at the tactical level, as they begin to percolate up through their various organizations, they don't forget those skills. They don't forget the 4 C's that they learn, as boots on the ground, and they work all the way up. And they begin to refine them as they work in a greater community sense. A couple of questions came in. One was, most of our information comes from the news. Also, when we had the pandemic, I didn't recall any meeting with leaders as to what needs to be done. Very interesting that the 2 of the read ahead articles deal with the pandemic. I was always challenged with the issues with the pandemic that the lead in a lot of jurisdictions was thrown to public health. Public health has some great doctors, whether they're medical doctors, epidemiologists, they have great MPHs. But public health, their role typically isn't to manage operational or logistical challenges. So the Canadian article, the article from Toronto Sun, says that emergency management belongs in the offices of the prime ministers, premiers, and mayors. He says because in COVID-19, the wrong people are being forced to do the wrong jobs. Political pressure should never change scientific advice. So you take your public health officials or your MDs or your MPHs, and you say, okay, you bring us good science, but what should we do in terms of how we get the vaccine out or how we manage things from a social or from an operational perspective or logistics? We learned back in H1N1 that the big hiccup in H1N1 wasn't the public health or the medical challenges, it was logistics. And so now we have, the COVID-19 and, Herculean job was done developing the vaccine, but vaccinating became the challenge. So we still, for a long time, we kept that in the purview of, the medical world and the public health world, when, from my perspective, there should have been I'm thinking we could have had a better integration and a better synergy with logistics and operational folks. In the Toronto Sun article, it says the root problem lies in the system that the government established to make decisions about the pandemic. Lacking any background in emergency management, we foisted it on the medical arena and the public health arena. It forces medical professionals into decisions they aren't equipped to make and they don't necessarily want to make. Doctors give medical advice because the medical experts were inevitably pressured into changing their best medical advice based upon the other challenges that surround a pandemic. Emergency management, again, is the only government function which is designed to take in information from all sectors. And the other thing is science doesn't care what politicians want to happen. So there's got to be some balance there. But both of those articles deal with the pandemic. One, Warp Speed did an amazing job developing the vaccine. But like I said, developing the vaccine is one part of this equation. Vaccinating is the other significant part. Every day is a training day. Every event is a training event. We probably learn less from our successes, and so it's a relatively less, because I would say that success validates what we thought would work. And it's just like, okay, yeah, we knew that would work. The failures or the hiccups definitely tell us what didn't work or isn't working. So I think we need to be honest with ourselves. So we'll see this in the next decade, because there'll be thousands of AARs regarding COVID, whether how a neighborhood handled it, all the way to how the nation handled it. A number of times over. The honesty and the integrity of these multiple after action efforts will tell us how we'll do in the next crazy, landscape-sized disaster or crisis that we have. So one of the things that I've always done in organizations I've been associated with is immediately hold hot washes, long before the formal after action, and went around the room, give me 3 ups, 3 downs. And the ups and downs had to be about things that you were specifically responsible for, so it didn't turn into a blame placement opportunity. So the downs had to be things that you felt you could have done better or you needed to improve on. And I think that's an interesting way for organizations or the various disciplines and sectors to look at these issues, because like I said, every day is a training day, every event and every incident is a training incident, in terms of what we can learn. And we don't want to just have lessons learned. We want to have lessons learned, We don't want just lessons observed. My worst incident as an emergency management was probably the Aliso Canyon gas leak. Once again, because it had to do with perspective. We have the Aliso Canyon, it's one of the largest natural gas repositories in the country. Now, I'm thinking these big tanks, but it's actually, the gas is held in the rock underground. There's a leak there because there's a huge, very vibrant community adjacent to the gas storage. And it was a big hue and cry about the gas leaking. And I'm arguing with the mayor's office saying it's not a big deal. Why? Because I'm looking at this through the prism, my firefighter prism. And I'm seeing the lower explosive level, because of prevailing winds, is not an issue. You're not going to have enough gas concentrated to cause some combustion or explosion or fire. And yes, it smells because natural gas has an odorant in it. So we know when it's leaking. We know when it's around. Both of those are accurate. Both of those were right answers, but it wasn't the correct answer for that situation, because it was a public health, public relations, and crisis information disaster happening right on my doorstep. And because I didn't bring in once I got the green folks and the neighborhood activists at the table, once I actually went back, reset myself and went back to my power to convene, and I said, who's not at the table, who needs to be at the table, and I got to see the various perspectives, I realized what the challenge was, and we began to handle it, and we worked through it. But that was probably one of the worst decisions or situations I've been in emergency management. Fire, probably personnel issues, but we won't get into that. But there's differences, but what I realized when I went back as the interim fire chief and when I was the general manager at EMD was I needed to be more conscious of getting the different perspectives, various disciplines, various people in the organization at the table to help me see the cone in the cube. November 1, 2013 was my very first day as the interim fire chief. LAX happened at 9:20. I'd been at work since 6:30 that morning. Very interesting day. I had the benefit of having a very seasoned staff who I'd known for decades. They knew me. I knew what I didn't know. I knew what they knew. We also had, we were able to, the convening, we kind of did that on the fly. We were able to talk around things. And the other thing is that as you go up in an organization, my thing is you continue to train, but you also start to have to do what I call development. Training, as I mentioned earlier, is rules, to me, is rules, tools, processes, and procedures. Development and education is knowing what questions to ask up, what questions to ask laterally, and what questions to ask down. So I've learned that my effort in roles in which I've been the quote unquote leader was to be humble enough to ask questions, to find out what I don't know. And also asking the questions helps validate what I do know. I always talk about the Featherstone LLC, lifetime learner, listening leader, and technical competency. So my suggestion would be, as folks rise up, or they move up the ladder or move to more positions of greater responsibility, is to keep learning. Reading, huge part of my development has been reading. Remember in a webinar several months ago with General Stanley McChrystal, and I asked him about reading, and he said, Jim, he says, all leaders have to read. He says, because the tuition at the School of Experience is too high. He says, that's like figuring out a minefield by stepping on each mine instead of reading the map that says where the mines are, or reading on what the strategy is for your adversary laying the mines. He said, and I'm paraphrasing now, but he said, the tuition at the School of Experience is too high for leaders not to read, to have a better understanding of what they are facing and what they may face. So I've always found leading up to be a challenge, because I'm, and those of you on the call know me, I'm not, I don't take well to people that above me. I tend to be a disruptive thinker, but as I've matured, I've learned to, one, you always have to demonstrate the value that your team, or your component bring to any event, engagement, or opportunity. The other thing is you should seek value add opportunities, because especially in the emergency management world, people don't always recognize what emergency management is or what emergency management does. They certainly know when there is no emergency management capability at play, but they don't always know. I always say that I work for two mayors. Neither one of them hired me to be the optimist. Not saying to be doomsday, but they hired me, or they kept me on, because they needed me to be around when things weren't going right, or we may have been in jeopardy of having a bad day in Los Angeles. So the opportunity to always bring value. The other thing is to be able to establish early on a dialogue with the elected political officials. We used to do for every council office, we would do what we call EOC 101. We'd have the council member and their staff come in, and we take them through a brief, walk them through the EOC, talk about what happened there, but we talk more about what their role could be during a bad day, or in preparation for a bad day. And so you have to keep them informed. The old adage, from my PIO days, was that, you feed the bear or the bear eats you. So we kept the officers informed to the point of over-informing them, but that way, you don't have them beating down your door or trying to step in. A lot of times in emergency management vacuums, the political officials will step in to fill that vacuum. Because if there's an emergency management vacuum and you have the potential for a significant incident, event, or crisis, the public expects somebody to do something. And if there's an emergency management vacuum, trust me, the elected officials will fill that vacuum. I would have liked to have more success in those areas. So I tend to look at, the elected officials. Each one of them has a different television channel that they operate on, so to speak. So you can't give two of them the same information in the same way. One elected official may understand a dozen eggs. The other elected official may only understand it when you tell them there are 12 eggs. It can be the same information, and I think that the savvy senior leader understands what code or what channel to put to encrypt that information in so it resonates with the elected officials. The other thing is that keep them educated on what you do. They can guess what you do, and I'm sure they have a lot of staffers that are going to explain to them what you do. But you, as a senior leader, you have a responsibility to keep them educated in terms of what you do. One of the key things with that is, then they don't expect you to do things that are out of your span of control or out of your capabilities. So let me work that in reverse. So we've lost the public expectation battle. I mean, there's just, there's an expectation that government or large corporations will do the impossible always. So the public expectation, we will never meet the extreme public expectation because this is America. We are used to being gratified. We have a sense of gratification. Just like, with supply chain resilience, if you can't find something at Ralph's, then you go down the street and you get it at Vons, or you go to Safeway and get it, or whatever. So we just move on. So so meeting public expectation is always going to be a challenge, but you have to do what's right for the greater good, and at the same time do what's right and correct for the what we call the MVCs, the most vulnerable communities. With commander's intent, so I've always tried to understand what the commander's intent is, and also support the commanders. So as an emergency manager, I have no operational or tactical capability or responsibility. As an emergency manager, I always felt I had a responsibility to coordinate the support of the commander's intent. As a professional, I think I have the responsibility to be honest with the commanders or the people above me and tell them what was not possible. But the commander's intent is the way we go. And I think having an understanding of that goes back to what I was saying earlier about training together, developing together, the sets and reps, being honest, developing working relationship and communication long before Mario Wade talks about blue sky leadership. So by exercising blue sky leadership, when you actually get to gray sky days, it's a little easier because you have a much better understanding and things have been put in place, whether they're tangible things or just intent and attitude is put in place and developed during the blue sky leadership opportunities. So when the sky grays over, it's just, the understanding and the relationship is there. Jim Stavridis's book, The Leader's Bookshelf, which is kind of like an anthology of little pieces from different books that Jim and his co-author interviewed like 200 contemporary leaders, and he had them recommend books that they thought were key books for leader development. And they picked the top 20. And it's interesting because when I first got the book, it was gifted to me. I'd actually read 12 of the 20 books already. It's very interesting because if you read Stavridis's book, it will pique your interest. Guarantee it will pique your interest in the 20 books if you haven't read them in many of the 20 books that are in Stavridis's book. So The Leader's Bookshelf. I'm actually reading the A to Z of GIS because in my last job, I worked around a bunch of tech wizards and they were talking things I had no idea what they were talking about. And the A to Z of GIS is actually some pretty simple definitions of, because I've actually started to look at the muscle that the GIS technology brings to crisis decision making. That and then Simon Sinek's books. So actually, both of those books came from two of the companies that I do a lot of work with. One is Quinn Williams, which is a consultancy here and a women-owned consultancy, crisis management consultancy here in LA that do really, really good work. And then the other is Bent Ear Solutions. They do some really, really neat things with crisis management technology. But folks that know me know that I read a lot. I send books to people all the time. And I tell you, my conversation with General McChrystal, I agree with him 100% that the tuition at the School of Experience is way too high not to read, so that I have some understanding of where I'm going and where I shouldn't go, more importantly. So one thing I picked up two quotes real quickly. One was from Michael Jordan, and I meant to throw a slide up. So that he says, "Talent wins games, but teamwork and intelligence wins championships." And the other one is one of my favorite quotes from Lincoln. He says, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then shall we save our country." So I appreciate the opportunity to have you all's ear. And although I can't see anyone today, this is a new experience for me, but it's all good. Hopefully we've been able to talk about some things that have some value for you back at Homeport. And David?
Well, again, thank you, Jim, for taking the time today to speak to us. We appreciate it and your ongoing support for the PELP program. I have just a couple of closing announcements. First of all, for any other general resources from CHDS, visit our website. Most of you have been on it already, chds.us. If you have questions about PELP, any of our programs under the PELP umbrella, feel free to contact any of us or contact me directly. If you don't have my email, it's available on the PELP website. It's djfukuto@nps.edu.